Good evening, everyone, again. It's a very happy occasion when we can gather together and think of the blessings that we have received from our beloved Lanello. And many of you here this evening would say from our beloved Mark, because you knew him personally. I'm grateful that we could come together in anticipation of the 22nd anniversary of his ascension, that we could come together ahead of time and talk about what we have received from Lanello, so that we could share these testimonies with students in the field, so that they could have them on the Ascension Day. On that day, we will have Lanello's dictation, and they will get it a week later. So we thought that this was a time to celebrate the very deep things that have touched our souls and our hearts. For those of you who did not know him personally, physically, in person, you know him every day when you recite the beautiful poetry that has become our standard decrees. You have heard him in the Only Mark albums. You've heard him in your soul as he has stood next to you in a time of trouble or questioning or burden. It was the spirit of Mark that set the geometry for this organization, for our movement, the 4 quarterly conferences. He was the first stumper. He went out in the Saab with Irwin Arndt, bless his heart, who is now at Penrose Hospital in Colorado Springs. Mark went stumping, I went stumping. So much of what we do here is what he taught me and the few that began this organization. And so we take for granted the many things that we see and what we have, but they have all come out of his magnanimous heart. So without delay, I would like to invite you to join us now in speaking from your heart on your friendship with Mark.
Good evening, Mother. Good evening, Seth. Good evening, everyone, both here and who will be seeing this tape. My name is Brewster Freeland, and I am in the construction department here on the ranch. I've been in the teachings since 1970. I joined the staff in 1971. I'm sorry to say it took me that long to figure out that this is where I belonged. And I owe literally my life to Mark Prophet. I don't think, in fact, as I look back at the direction that my life was going before I got into the teachings, that I would even still be here. I was on a wrong track. Well, Mark was a true Zen master, to whom nothing and everything was sacred. He was a man of faith to me, and I remember when I went to La Tourelle for the first time, and I walked in the building, you could feel his presence everywhere. He had a deep, abiding faith that was there from a constant communion. It was not pretentious, but it was so strong that it infused the whole building like a rose would a room. And he could be found everywhere and anywhere, and he was all over. He was so excited about what was going on and very in touch. We would have kitchen conferences late at night. He would sit in the kitchen to eat something, and we would all find some reason why we had to be there. And boy, were we grateful. We got little vignettes on politics, on current affairs, times of the day, situations, and it was wonderful. It was very personal. In that regard, I have to tell you one little story about, he wanted a sauna, so we built the sauna. And then he would invite a number of us to go into the sauna with him. And we, of course, would go, oh, sure! And he would start out, turn up the heat, Om Namo Narayanaya, Om Namo Narayanaya. And pretty soon, there you are, you're blissed out on this mantra, and when you see you're not looking, you start slapping you on your thigh, on your back. Om Namo Narayanaya, and you're going, ah! And he'd get all this energy, and all of a sudden he'd stop dead in his tracks, and then pick it all up and throw it. Literally, physically, you'd watch him do this, make this ball, and just throw it. We'd look at him. You know, you're all red and you're sore, and you can hardly believe it. And he'd break into this big roar of laughter because he just threw all this energy that he was knocking substance physically off of you. So he thought that was great. The other thing is he was always wrestling with you. And it was sometimes physical, literally, on the floor, in the kitchen, all of a sudden, wham! But it was also always spiritually, because he was on your side, and you just knew it. But he was a man of far-reaching vision as well. He was a lot like Noah. He had so much vision, we all thought we were pretty together. But he could see so much farther than we could. Noah, of course, saw what was coming and warned people, and they mocked him. Well, people mocked Mark. There was a time when Mark was driving back from Santa Barbara. He was driving, and he says, now I want you to do Estrellas silently. And he picks up the tape recorder, and he begins to dictate the series of pearls, I think part of which became the Dwal Kul series on the studies in alchemy. He did like 3 or 4 in a row, driving down the road, and there I am over on the side going, and all of a sudden he pulls over to the side of the road and says, look out, there's this crazy guy coming. And I look down the road and it's nobody there, nobody behind us. And about 2 minutes later, this car comes zooming around this corner into our lane where we would have been, back into its own lane and goes by us. And I thought to myself, gee. And I had the presence of mind, fortunately, to say, have the courage to say, how did you do that? He says, well, you have to realize that we have 4 lower bodies. And each of those 4 lower bodies has a mind, and all 4 of mine are more developed than your one. He says, I'm driving, and you have to be a defensive driver. So part of me is here driving, but I have one of my bodies is 300 feet up, watching both directions, because it pays to be a defensive driver. And of course, you don't know the names to name the people the forces that are trying to oppose these dictations. So I have to insert the names into your Estrellas. By the way, you're on 27. And simultaneously dictating this pearl of wisdom, driving down the road. This is the vision I'm talking about. He never showed it off. I mean, to meet the man was just a person, but he would keep coming up with these little things. But he was also a person of great personal caring and love. In this same drive, all of a sudden, he'd pick up the phone and call up George Lancaster, or he'd pick up the phone and call somebody in New York and just say, I just thought I should call you and see how everything is going. Yeah? Oh, she's in the hospital? Oh, this is terrible. Well, I'll make some calls for her right now. And he'd make these calls, and he loved to do this. At one of our staff meetings, all of a sudden he looked out and said, Brewster, you're going to Ghana with us. We're leaving in 3 days. Which was when it became necessary to have passports if you're on staff that are current, because I didn't. But the whole Ghana trip, I didn't get to go because I was special. I got to go because I needed parenting, and he knew it. And so I just got to go on this trip because I needed the parenting. And he gave me a month of his life. Actually, he and Mother both. There's no specific instance that I can share with you that proves my point more than the fact that he just took me along, for which I'm immensely grateful. But he was a man of intensity, too, not only love. If you'll notice, I've gone through the threefold flame here. Now we're on the white fire. There was a time when he loved the gold bus, which I'm sure somebody will tell you about the gold bus. He had this gold bus, was one of his stumping buses. And he was very integral in the building of it. And one day he decided it wasn't going very well. So he's outside the bus, and everybody who's working on that bus is getting a little bit of fire. And he's, "You, what are you doing that for? Why did you put the window in backwards? You, what are you standing around for? We got to get this thing done. We're in a hurry, you know. You!" He's just yelling at people, one after another, and I happened to just be walking by. I was coming from the Four Winds back to, and he goes, "You aren't even involved in this, you know." But everybody else, their sweat was coming off their brow. They thought the end of the world was here. But this was the man, bigger than life, and yet very humble. Knowing Linello doesn't make those of us who knew him special. Not at all. It makes Linello special because he was willing to give to us all of himself. To anybody who would stop to shake his hand. He would give him of his time, and we didn't at the time know how precious that particular commodity was, because I only knew him for 3 years. But we thought he was going to be here for 20. Not so. So we are privileged, but not special, those of us who knew him. You here are privileged because, in fact, I see him every day in this community. We're attempting to take the Master's teachings and bring them into the practical, which was Mark Prophet. He was practical. The teachings weren't of value if they weren't practical. So we're here trying to emulate him, I hope, with each other. So these are my thoughts and my hopes and my prayers and my thanks for having known Linello. Thank you.
My name is Paul O'Neill. I live in South Glastonbury, and I have been a student of the Ascended Masters since 1920. My first contact with Mark was when I received a letter in Atlanta, a letter sent to all those in this country who were in the office of President of the Theosophical Society. And I was very glad to return the inquiry asking for further information. And I did receive that. And then my next contact with Mark was when I went to Detroit to a conference of about 1,000 people, and I had arranged for Mark to be one of the speakers. I was very happy to do that. And my next contact with Mark was in Colorado Springs when I attended a conference there which was my first conference with the Summit Lighthouse. And I well remember that after the conference was over, I had to leave a day early because I was teaching for the Air Force. And Mark looked at me as I told him goodbye. And then he said, "I haven't told you a tenth of what I know." I realized as I left that day that he knew far more than a tenth of what he could tell me. And then I was teaching for the Air Force in South Georgia, and fortunately, from time to time, usually once a week for a period, Mark would telephone me. And on one occasion, he said, "You ought to do the Australia decree 48 times," which I did very religiously, and not with the speed that you have here. And of course, I did do the 48 decrees. And then I attended my next contact with Mark was in Detroit when I attended a conference of what was known as the Spiritual Unity of Nations. And we had 1,000 people attending the conference, and I had arranged for Mark to be one of the speakers. I was very proud of that. And then I received a telephone call from Colorado Springs notifying me and advising me that Mark was ill. I was teaching for the Air Force in Georgia. So I was invited to come immediately to Colorado Springs. And so I did. And from there on, the story was I attended the funeral conducted by Mother. We had a church, I'd say more than 300 people were there, the rough figure. And I learned later that Mark had made his ascension from Pikes Peak. And that concludes the story. It was indeed a great privilege to know Mark, and he was a great inspiration to me in several ways. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Mother. My name is Annice Booth. I've been privileged to know Mark since October of 1966 through February 73. I can't give you any specific thing that stands out in my mind tonight, so I'm going to give you just a few little vignettes of life with Mark. Brewster started it, and in 1968, that was before I was on the staff, Mark invited me to go on a trip to Europe with him and Mother and the children. I was fairly new, definitely new to the teachings and fairly new to the family. And I realized then what a great adept Mark was. And I think one of the sorrows of my life at that time was that so few people did realize the great adept with whom they were living. We got off the boat at Bremerhaven in Germany in the rain, and it was just pouring. And he had rented a Volkswagen bus for us to tour in. We put all of our luggage on the top, and we couldn't get a tarp in the whole city. Well, pretty soon, Mother said, Mark, our luggage is going to get ruined. He said, yes, it's raining. So all of a sudden, all he said was, peace, be still. And I have never in my life heard such love as those 3 words were. And the rain stopped just like that. Well, nobody said anything, and pretty soon somebody in the car said, oh, look, it just stopped raining. And no one caught the great impact of what he'd done. That was about my first experience with the powers that he had when used with love. Another time, he definitely was attuned with the elementals. There was no doubt about that. But one of the funniest things that I ever saw happen back at La Tourelle, I happened to be out hanging up some laundry, and he had, as Brewster said, just taken a Trailway bus and converted it to our gold bus and joined a touring club. You remember that? And part of it was that to be a member of this club, basically you should have a motorcycle attached behind your bus. So when you parked in town, you could ride a motorcycle. Well, Mark had always wanted a motorcycle. One day I was out in the laundry. He came dashing in through the gate going, ee, 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 ee. And I'm not exaggerating. There was a rain right down where he and the motorcycle was. That was it. Everything was dry, both sides everywhere. This little elemental was following him. Finally, he was just dripping. He says, he wanted to play and I couldn't get him to stop. All the rest of us were completely dry. 1968, I still was not on staff yet, and he phoned and said that he and Alex Reichardt were driving out because the masters thought it was quite a possibility that there might be a very serious earthquake in San Francisco and the coast. If he could get out in time and get a dictation for when the masters, perhaps they could stop it. So he came to our home, and we arranged a meeting in San Francisco, and Davis Vadamanu dictated, and the earthquake was stopped. So he stayed at our home for a couple days. And I thought I'd probably fed the man enough of my own cooking. And finally said, wouldn't you like to go downtown for lunch? I know a lovely little place one of my friends has, very private. So it was a very, very hot day, and we came out from our lunch. And I said, wow, would I like to be able to take that air conditioning with me? And he didn't say anything, and pretty soon I just started to shiver. Absolutely shivered, bumps all over, and I said, Mark, what are you doing to me? And he said, well, you said you wouldn't take the air conditioning with you. I said, well, please turn it off. At La Tourelle, I was helping complete Climb the Highest Mountain, but also in my spare time, I was Mark's correspondence secretary. Now, that didn't mean that I ever wrote any letters for him. I was supposed to take charge of his junk mail. We spent hours poring over advertisements for belts, ties, wallets, boots, shirts, and by the time he ascended, I had a 4-drawer filing cabinet completely full of this junk mail. And I said, Mark, don't you think we should clean this out? No, 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 someday I might need to buy something like that. Well, it wasn't until he descended that I realized that he was keeping me with him all those hours so that I would get to know him. I'm sure he was giving me instruction on the inner also, but so I would get to know him, how he felt, how he worked, and how he acted, so that I could be working in the various teaching centers in the future. But it took me a long time to realize the reason for correspondence secretary. Well, I wouldn't miss 1 minute of life with Mark and his staff, but it certainly had its challenges. Any of you who've ever heard our tape, what's it called? Momentum of Joy, or what's the name of it? Miracle of Joy. You remember that laughing bag? Well, Mark one day went downtown, bought a laughing bag, and came back and showed it at the staff meeting. It was fun. It was a way of everyone relaxing, and he was enjoying it. But this correspondence secretary, it became the bane of my existence. I'd be sitting in his office, Mrs. Booth, get me a letter out of that drawer. Open the door. goes the laughing bag. Of course, Mark would just be laughing. So that went on for weeks. Finally, I almost had nervous breakdown. I was afraid to open any drawer. So one day he said, Mrs. Booth, I need that letter. And I said, not me. The laughing bag's in there. He said, Mrs. Booth, I promise you on my honor, the laughing bag's not in there. I said, okay. So I opened the drawer and got in the letter. Next thing I opened the other drawer, goes the laughing bag. I think, though, it was ways like that, and as Brewster said, his wrestling with the man, that he was able partly to release himself from the tensions where he was holding the balance for the earth and the many things that he was doing for the brotherhood. Another time, and this was very serious, we were on the completion of the Climb the Highest Mountain. We were on the last phases, and those of us working were not supposed to do anything except work in the book. We were not even supposed to go in and decree in the chapel. So finally I realized all my dresses were dirty, barring none, and I had to go wash them. So he came down the laundry and said, what are you doing down here? You're supposed to be working in the book. I said, my dresses are all dirty. And then I got very flip, which I had since learned not to do. I said, I don't see why the Violet Flame shouldn't take care of my laundry. And he got very, very serious, and he said, yes, Mrs. Booth, you get very, very close to God, and then God will let his Violet Flame do your laundry. Now, get back to work. When we purchased Santa Barbara for the Focus for the Mother House, there was a lot of work to be done. It had been very run down and dirty. And we worked, almost a year, in fact. And it came time for the Easter Conference 1970, was when Mark opened the Mother House. So he and I drove out in his, I don't think it was a yellow bus, it was a Cortez by that time. Mother was still working on the book. She flew out later. But he and I had about 3 or 4 days there before the conference opened. He said, well, look at that lawn, Mrs. Booth. Of course, I'd been back there working on the book all the time. He said, would you let cactus grow? That's a cactus garden. That's not a lawn. And I said, well, you bought it that was the way it was. He said, I will not have an Easter conference with cactus. It had these big century plants, they're so high, and the crown of thorns. And he said, that's what they put on Jesus' head. I will not have that. He said, you get to work, get out that cactus and put me in a lawn. 3 days. Well, that was the first time I realized that there was the sod that you could roll out, So we got our pickup truck, pulled out those huge cactuses, rolled him out a lawn, and there he had a beautiful 3-day lawn ready to start his conference. I thought everything was going very, very nicely, and all of a sudden he says, I've been walking around and you didn't make any curtains for those last two windows back there. And I said, I didn't have time. He said, okay, I want curtains right today before I want no conference. So of course I went downtown and made curtains immediately. I thought, well, now nothing else can go wrong. He said, Mrs. Booth, this sanctuary color is not pink enough. I said, Mark, I sent you a sample of the paint. And he says, I can't help it, it's not pink enough. So he said, you stand here, pull with me, and I've got to make this pinker. And between his calls and chants, and it was the most beautiful, I wish we had it on tape, things, you could just gradually see that pink paint getting pinker. So we had a beautiful conference, and then the next day after the conference, we took off for India. And that's when I realized what the human body can stand and still stay alive. Another time he came out to Santa Barbara, it was going to be for a Christmas class. And he took one look and he says, Mrs. Booth, you've let my lawn die. I said, Mark, the lawn isn't dead. This is Lipia grass. This is Santa Barbara, and this is a grass that's always planted. And December and January are the dormant times. He said, I refuse to have a Christmas conference with dead grass. What are you going to do about it? And I said, well, I don't know. Again, I got flippant. Unless you want me to paint it green. He says, that's exactly what I want you to do, Mrs. Booth. So I went down to the nursery and I said, do you have any green paint for lawns? He said, oh, yes. So our men sprayed, and we had the most beautiful green lawn for the only green lawn in Santa Barbara, believe me. Well, there's one thing that I remembered from our conferences at Colorado Springs. He took the brunt of most of the lectures and the dictations. I think Mother usually did one lecture and one dictation and then led the decrees. But Mark had the brunt of it all, and we didn't have a tag going to support him. So usually about the last day, very often his voice would get very hoarse. So he would come in wearing a violet silk scarf that he bought in India, and we'd know that he was going to say, "Bring me my Longfellow book." And he would read some of the most glorious passages from Longfellow, which I do hope we have on tape. At his memorial service, as Paul O'Neill was saying, almost the entire town, it seemed to me, at least a cross-section of the town, arrived. There were men from the filling station, from the cleaners, from the grocery, on and on and on, who knew Mark and who wanted to come when they heard that he had passed. It's almost like Will Rogers said, "I never saw a man I couldn't love." Well, I think that was the way with Mark. Now, on page 249 of Climb the Highest Mountain, we find a quote from St. Germain from the trilogy. It says, "Men and women of the first ray who successfully invoke power do so by turning within to the great flood tides of love and drawing therefrom the power of God." And that was Mark Prophet.
Good evening, Mother. Good evening, everybody. My name is Alex Reichardt, and I work in the shipping department. In fact, I run the shipping department, and this was actually foretold to me over 25 years ago by Mark Prophet himself, who told me that I was going to be in charge of a mailing facility where there were going to be over 100 people, and that's exactly what we have at LRY in Livingston. A few instances in my life that I had the privilege of knowing Mark Prophet, which actually went back to the 60s. My first conference was in 1963. I joined staff in 1965, so I've been a student of the Ascended Masters for about 31 years. And I had the privilege of going around the country with Mark on his people-to-people journey, and I experienced firsthand what it means to be around what I would call a saint. He would get up very early in the morning. He would drive all day long to his point of destination, and then he would give a sermon at night, and then after the sermon, he would go ahead and then give a dictation, and then he would talk to people. He would plead with people to please embrace the teachings. And one instance in Portland in the latter 60s I wanted to let you know about, and that was the fact that about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, I can still remember, he pleaded with 2 people to please embrace the teachings. And I could tell that it was a serious moment for both him and for the people. And these people happened to be the parents of a staff member. And although he talked to them at great length, they were not ready to embrace the teachings at that point in their life. And I could see that Mark was a little bit disappointed and even disheartened by it. And 6 months later, I found out that they had actually perished in a plane crash, which he no doubt could see. And at another time, when I was going around the country with him, he took a vacation to the Tetons, and we went in the Trafco with Ruth Jones and Aaron. And he was in a real jovial mood, and we were going across the plain right before you get to the Tetons, and there was a cowpoke with some of his cattle on the side of the road, and he had a speaker on top of the Trafco, and he thought he'd play a joke on the guy on the side of the road. So he got this little microphone, and he said, "Howdy, partner," just like that, and the cowpoke jumped around. He looked at his cows, and he couldn't figure out where the sound was coming from. So we made our way to the Tetons at the very base of it, and he gave a dictation from Lonto, and he had Ruth Jones and myself guarding the force field to make sure no one was going to come too close to the Trafco. And then that night he had a birthday party for Ruth Jones because it happened to be her birthday. She's since ascended. And like so many times when Mark went on these trips, he was called back unexpectedly to La Tourelle because of some urgent business he had to take care of. And another time when I was going across the country, this time to California, Mother was just beginning her training as a messenger. And at one point he said along the desert, "Elizabeth has just started her dictation." And I believe it was from Kuan Yin, but I'm not sure. Another thing that Mark was very good at is reading people's thoughts. I had been down at Colorado College in Colorado Springs for an open house, and I went back to the kitchen at La Tourelle, and I was standing there thinking about one of the girls I had met at that social, and Mark looked up from his table and looked at me, and he said, "What's her name?" Back at La Tourelle, we used to have a system whenever there was a meeting called for and everybody was supposed to come to the chapel, or there was anything important that needed to be told everyone, you'd buzz 5 on the intercom system. So it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and everybody would pick up the phone, and then they would have to congregate in the chapel. On one such occasion, the thing that actually precipitated it was that Mark and I were in the basement of La Tourelle, which was also the graphics area and also the mailroom, and he wanted to go upstairs to the 3rd floor. So we went to the elevator, and he pushed the button, and nothing happened. And he said, "Well, let's go up to the 2nd floor and see if the gate's open, because if the gate's open, then you can't use the elevator." So we went up to the 2nd floor, no elevator. So we went to the 3rd floor, and no elevator. So he called everybody in the chapel, and he said, once again, the gate to the elevator was left open, and he wants to know who did it. And if it happens again, he's going to suspend the person from staff for 2 weeks. So everybody was very tense and on the edge of their seat, wondering what was going to happen. And then the mother looked up and she says, "Well, if you do that, everyone's going to leave the gate to the elevator open because they'll all get 2 weeks off." So Mark started laughing, and then that kind of concluded that, and we never heard another word about the elevator. This brings me to another point. After Mark ascended, we were gathered in the back kitchen of La Tourelle, and Phoebe Hamden was there washing her dishes faithfully as she had done, and we heard the back gate buzzer, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So Phoebe said, "Oh, some kids must be out there. Why doesn't someone go out and check?" So they went out there, and there was no one there. And then once again, that proved to her that this was just pranksters at the back gate. I don't know if you've been to La Tourelle. If you were not, you probably don't know. We had a big gate around La Tourelle, and therefore, in order to get in, there was a back buzzer, and you'd have to ring the buzzer in order to gain access. So once again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We heard the same thing. So Mother got wind of it and thought, well, maybe this is a message from Linello, that maybe there's a problem in the building somewhere. So we started going all through the building. What could be wrong? We went to the attic, nothing there. We went to the main floor, everything seemed to be fine, and we went to the basement. And then Mother said, check the gatehouse. So we checked the gatehouse, and there was about 3 feet of water that was flooded in the basement of the gatehouse. And if the water had gone up much higher, my understanding was that it's a possibility that the gatehouse could have actually blown up, because we had a furnace, we had a boiler room there, and so we had a whole water brigade going, one after the other, going at that time. When I first joined staff back in '65, Sean was a baby, and I was taking care of him downstairs in the basement of Beacon's Head in Vienna, Virginia, where the headquarters was at that time. That was back in '65. And Sean was beginning to crawl under a piece of furniture. And all of a sudden, like a bolt of lightning, Mark darted down the stairs and yanked Sean from out underneath the furniture and explained to me that there was a mousetrap there and that Sean was almost about ready to reach his hand into the mousetrap, and Almoria had warned Mark about it, and therefore he had come down to the rescue. And that's the attunement of a man of God, such as Mark was. One time, Mark was going through the chapel at La Tourelle, and I followed him, and as he had gone through the chapel into the library, which was the adjoining room, he told me something, and I didn't hear him. So I shouted across the chapel, asking him what he had said. And as soon as I got into the library, I found out more than what he said. He told me I had karma. And he told me that I had shattered the force field that the angels had created in that room, and that my karma was going to last a week. and I think it did. Another thing he told me is that he could actually see through bodies. He could actually look into a body and see the organs in the body and see the correct correlation of the organs, and then he looked at me and he said, "You've got a block in your head." And he also told me sometimes it was a problem. He'd have to turn it off because he would see someone who looked nice and he'd see all the organs, and it was a problem. And he also looked at me one day and he says, "Look at me." And I looked at him. He says, "What do you see?" And I was trying to find out what he was coming to, what his point was. And then he covered underneath his nose and he says, "Don't you see the resemblance to Elmoria? I'm Elmoria's son." And he looked at me and I said, "Yes, I can certainly see it." He also made a reference to his ascension one day. And he said, "I wonder what people are going to think, when I'm ascended, and what their reaction is going to be." And he had already projected himself into the future from that standpoint. Another thing he said is that the masters are so real, and he pointed out the fact that the staff back at Beacon's Head did not realize that the masters actually walked through the halls of Beacon's Head and sat in the chairs whenever there was a vacant chair. And I think that this is something we should remember even here. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Mother.
Good evening, Dorothy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can't hear you. My name is Dorothy Lee Fulton. Yes, I do have a last name. You don't hear it very much. I've been in the teaching since the early 60s. That was before Sean was born. This lady sitting up here in this chair told me the first time she ever saw me, she said, "You will bring forth the music for this organization." I would say about 35 years ago, something like that, 34. I doubt she remembers it because the master said it through her the very first time I met her. My function with this organization was foretold by beloved Mother Mary that she would place the music through me, through our guru, where I could lay it at her feet so she could give it to her chelas. Is that a fact? I can't hear you. Yes. Right. I was going to tell you a story tonight, a real quick one, about sitting at a piano, and Mark, after his ascension, was speaking to me and giving me some instructions what to do. It was going to be really cut and dried because I took him at his word. He was telling me that I should get in touch with a certain person, and he called him by his first name, Milton. And I'm sitting there wondering why I should get in touch with Milton. Milton was my childhood sweetheart that we never could seem to get together because he was so bashful. But Mark had a great lesson he wanted to teach me. He was telling me to do this. When I would get out of the sanctuary, I would forget it. When I would come back, I had a pet name then. People called me Linda. He said, "Linda, you didn't call Milton." Oh, Mark, I didn't think of it after I got out of here. This happened several times. You didn't call Milton. You must call Milton and get with him, possible marriage. This was a man, and when he was a child, he was very much in love with me, but he was too bashful to let me know. I knew it, but he would never say it, so he went his way and I went mine. I was going to tell you this story in a cut and dried manner. Mother says that isn't a true story. I said, what about it isn't true? She said, this is a love story. The way you're telling it, there's no love. So I'll have to tell you what Mark was trying to teach me. There was a young country boy come to town, come to church, and he fell in love with this little teenager, but he was too bashful to do anything about it. So the other fellow would walk me home, and I would look back, and Milton would be trailing along. Every time, you just knew he was back there. Never said a word. To make the long story short, he went his way, and I went mine. I married, but he didn't. He waited till middle life, and then he married. His wife passed away. But during these years, it was many years, I would go to the mailbox. We used to just have mailboxes right at the front of the door, you know. And now and then I would get a letter that said, Dear wife, so-and-so and so-and-so, so-and-so, and he would sign it, your husband. We hadn't seen each other in years. This happened again and again. This was Milton. Now, I'll bring you up to the time when I'm sitting at the organ or the piano, whatever it was, in La Tourelle. Mark had ascended. He said, you must get with Milton. So finally, he told me, Milton's lifespan is shorter than yours. You must get with Milton. So I'm understanding now. It was all right with me because you couldn't keep from loving him anyway. And he was already in love, so we didn't have a lot we had to work on. So I said, Mark, I tell you the first thing I'm going to do when I leave here. I knew he was going to teach me something. Mark was teaching me something. So I went to the telephone and I called Milton. Many years I hadn't seen him. I had to get the number from my sister. She said, oh yes, he checks on you often. He knows all about you. He knows where you are. I said, well, I'm going to find out where he is now. Well, I called him and he fainted. Nobody's there, nobody's there, nobody's there. Here I am on long distance. And you know how much money we have on staff. You know this, don't you? He would come back to the phone, he'd say, I can't believe it. Is it you? I said, stay with the phone. This is long distance. Oh, don't bother about that plop. And he'd faint again. I waited and I waited and I waited. He finally came back. He says, this isn't possible. And I'm thinking about Mark. Mark had something he wanted to teach me here. He was telling me that later in life, I would need the finances and I would need Milton. When I called Mother, she was in Santa Barbara, I think, that I was thinking about getting married, and what did she think about it? She said, I didn't even know that you knew anybody. I said, I don't. she didn't know then that I was really working under orders of the great chief, our chief. And so I guess, as the old saying goes, all hell did break loose. I'll tell you what happened when we were trying to get to her to getting married. The airplane quit and wouldn't do anything. We tried every direction to try to get off the ground, and it didn't happen, so we had to get on another airplane. While we were trying to get to the airplane, had a car wreck. By the time I got in the depot, the people were waiting. Mother was waiting. The loudspeaker was calling my name, and I was rushing over to see what was going on. I fell and broke my foot. This was a hard-earned lesson, but I found out what it was. Milton taught me love. I'm not speaking especially about physical love. This man had known me lifetimes and had taken care of me and loved me for lifetimes. He taught me how important love was. The first time he saw my guru, there was no foolishness about our silly church or anything. He loved her from the beginning. He would kiss her feet if she would let him. That's how much he revered her. But when you are singing these songs, and I know you love them, because who could not love them? Think of Mother Mary first, our beloved guru, for making it possible. Without her, we could not have it. And then think of the love that Milton Fulton showed us. It's true that his lifespan was much shorter than mine. We had 12 years together like Mother and Mark had. He still supports the church, and I get a check from him every month. Thank you.